As the cavalcade of central bankers and finance ministers descended on Washington this spring, a cautious sense of relief was palpable. The dark clouds of recession that had loomed so ominously just months ago seemed to be parting, at least for the moment. Christine Lagarde, steward of the European Central Bank, allowed herself a rare burst of optimism. The signs of recovery were clearly visible, she proclaimed. A phenomenal job market beckoned, promising a rebound that would steadily gather momentum throughout 2024. This buoyant mood echoed through the marbled corridors and opulent ballrooms where the high priests of global economics gathered. The robust American economy, voracious domestic demand in India, waning inflation in many quarters, these positive strands were weaving together into a tapestry far more encouraging than the dire patterns of just a half-year prior. The International Monetary Fund now projects global growth of 3.2% for 2023, a modest but significant upgrade from its previous 2.9% forecast. The mood this time was a bit more positive, observed Masood Ahmed, president of the Center for Global Development and a veteran of both the IMF and World Bank trenches. The near-term economic outlook is a little better. Yet any untrammeled celebration would be sharply premature. For as the policymakers clinked glasses and exchanged backslaps, two ominous storm clouds continued to loom on the horizon, obscuring the sun peeking through the present haze. The first is the nagging persistence of inflationary pressures in the United States. As Fed Chair Jerome Powell and his compatriots scan the economic data, they see inflation becoming increasingly entrenched in endemic areas like rents and services. This stubbornly sticky price growth threatens to force the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer, a monetary policy stance that would reverberate globally. For emerging markets burdened with heavy dollar-denominated debts, elevated U.S. interest rates could quickly become a fiscal millstone. Their borrowing costs would spike in lockstep with Fed rates, imperiling flows of investment and trade. Even for the European Central Bank and its counterparts, hopes of loosening monetary policy in stride with the U.S. could be dashed if Powell's team is compelled to hold its aggressive posture. But it is the second, more existential cloud that casts a darker penumbra over the economic future, a deepening conviction among global authorities that the world is slouching toward a dreaded era of insipid, stagnant growth for the remainder of this decade and beyond. The IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, put voice to these fears in the run-up to the spring meetings. Without dramatic course corrections from policymakers, she warned gravely, the world risks succumbing to the tepid 20s. This was no idle rhetorical flourish, but a prognosis grounded in the IMF's latest mediocre medium-term forecasts for global economic expansion. The longitudinal projections contained in the fund's World Economic Outlook augured a decline of over a percentage point in worldwide growth compared to pre-pandemic averages by the decade's close. For an organization that views robust growth as the wellspring of progress and poverty reduction, this represented a looming calamity. What dark forces were conspiring to cast such a pall? In the IMF's quadramatic view, an unholy amalgam of laggard productivity gains, a retrenchment from globalization, and an upsurge in disruptive geopolitical conflicts were forming a toxic admixture, dragging growth down to paltry levels portending widespread popular discontent. The world's poorest nations appeared at gravest risk of falling tragically behind. That is what I think about when I wake up in the middle of the night, Georgieva confided, the furrows of anxiety creasing her brow. At the core of the fund's glum prognosis is the belief that the extended period of lax monetary policy in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis fostered a wasteful misallocation of capital. Inefficient, unproductive zombie firms were allowed to shamble along, sapping investment that could have been directed toward more fertile, innovative purposes. The inevitable result, according to this analysis, was an anemic rate of productivity growth across major economies, most starkly in the European Union. With investment depressed and populations graying, reversing this inertial slide could prove wrenchingly difficult, sapping economic vigor for years to come. There were a whole series of positive supply shocks through the 1990s and 2000s, observed Donald Cohn, a former Fed vice chair now residing at the Brookings Institution. The fall of the Iron Curtain, the integration of Eastern Europe, China's entry into the WTO, and so on. But those bracing uplifting forces have petered out, their stimulating effects largely played out. In their place, a succession of destabilizing blows, the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rolling waves of protectionism and deglobalization, have battered the global economy in recent years. That's clearly bad news, Cohn remarked with folksy understatement. Meanwhile, the demographic tailwind that had aided growth for decades has fully reversed direction. The vast expansion of the global labor supply, as developing nations like China and India joined the world workforce, has largely run its course. With fewer workers relative to population, upward pressure on wages and prices seems inexorable, necessitating tighter monetary policies that could choke off economic vitality. That will need to be countered by central banks, Cohn noted. For many in the corridors of power, however, the paramount bogeyman stalking the future of global growth is the specter of trade fragmentation. The edifice of international commerce so painstakingly constructed over decades of liberal leadership now seems to be crumbling under the weight of ascendant mercantilism. Once anathema, the embrace of muscular industrial policy by the world's major powers is now unabashedly de rigueur. The three economic leviathans, China, the European Union, and the United States, accounted for nearly half of over 2,500 protectionist policy interventions worldwide last year, by the IMF's reckoning. Geeta Gopinath, the fund's first deputy managing director, quantified the potential toll of such fragmentation as high as 7% of global GDP. The forces propelling this renaissance of economic nationalism are multifarious but unarguably potent. For democratic leaders accountable to restive electorates, shielding domestic industries and preserving jobs has become an imperative that trumps abstruse theoretical models touting the virtues of free trade. With over half the world's population facing the ballot box this year, including the United States and many European nations, the temptation to score political points through trade brinkmanship could prove overwhelming. Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, has already vowed to slap a 10% tariff on all imports if elected, a proposal roundly criticized this week by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, head of the World Trade Organization. "I hope sincerely that will not happen," the WTO Director General urged at a Peterson Institute event. But prayers seemed feeble bulwarks against the bipartisan protectionist headwinds billowing through the American Capitol. Even President Joe Biden joined the chorus, declaring his desire to triple tariffs on Chinese steel. On the sidelines of the spring meetings, rumbling critiques of the post-war economic architecture could be heard with increasing volume. The sins of globalism were decried, a self-serving ideology propagated by powerful elites heedless of the fraying social contract and the toll on those left behind. The problem over the past 50 years was not globalization, it was globalism, intoned Ian Bremmer, founder of Eurasia Group. It was decisions being made by a small number of beneficiaries that were very powerful, that said, "We're not going to pay attention to the fact that the social contract is eroding." If these ominous trends persist unchecked, the doomsayers at the IMF fear a vicious cycle could take hold, with fragmented markets depressing trade and investment, which in turn crimps productivity and overall economic dynamism, which fuels yet more populist battering against the liberal economic order in a spiraling race to the bottom. So what is to be done? Fund officials implored policymakers to embrace a host of regenerative remedies to rekindle productivity growth and forestall the dire, tepid 20s scenario. Plugging the gaping investment gap is cast as imperative, although finding fresh capital could prove devilishly difficult in an era of overtaxed public coffers. Nevertheless, some potential paths were ventured. More greenfield immigration, a crucial component of America's recent prosperity according to many gathered in Washington, was touted as one pathway to renewed labor force vitality. Enhancing workforce participation among women and strengthening skills training programs could similarly boost economic potential, and emerging technologies like generative artificial intelligence might provide a productivity catalyst, augmenting human labor in a variety of fields while reducing time devoted to rote tasks. Yet each such proposal faced its own political hazards or fiscal constraints. The Dutch finance minister, Steven van Weyenberg, captured the bind confronting policymakers seeking to find new drivers of growth, marrying the incredible amounts of investment required with the imperative of sound and sustainable public finances requires choices. There is quite a challenge ahead here, for few nations did that challenge loom larger than the United States itself. With a fiscal deficit projected to top 7% of GDP next year, more than triple the average for other advanced economies, Washington's budgetary room for expansive economic revitalization efforts appeared severely circumscribed. Alarmingly, the Congressional Budget Office foresees U.S. interest expenses alone eclipsing $1 trillion annually after 2026. But America was hardly alone in embracing a fiscal stance that struck many economists as cavalier or downright foolhardy. China, grappling with incipient deflation and slowing growth, is on track for a deficit of 7.6% of GDP in 2025, more than double the emerging market average.
There was a pervading sense that in an era of ubiquitous shocks and upheaval, pandemics, wars, climatic calamities, governments had become reflexively inured to the mounting fiscal risks. "There's a tolerance and willingness to live with these risks," said Ms. Diamond. "People read that there's a massive U.S. deficit, and think that's true, but then just get on with their lives." Complacency, or perhaps impotence in the face of larger forces, seems to have taken root even among the technocratic elite. The doomsaying over long-term growth trajectories elicited a noticeable ennui, a world weariness bordering on resignation from those gathered in the lending institution's neoclassical headquarters. After all, the looming economic penumbra had been held at bay, at least for the moment. The synchronized global downturn so fretfully anticipated just months prior had failed to materialize. The soft landing, that delicate avian hoped for but so rarely achieved, appeared well in hand as central bankers cooed over the green economic shoots, peeking through the frost-bitten landscape. "People are less worried about the near term now," observed Ahmed, the former IMF official. A hazy respite from existential angst, however fleeting, could perhaps be forgiven. Yet Kristalina Georgieva's midnight agonies persisted unabated. For the Bulgarian economist bestride the global crisis lender, the descending, Swiss ski slope of growth embodied in the World Economic Outlook was a trauma too searing to be anesthetized by the faint upswing winding through 2024.
"I don't want that for the future," the IMF chief agonized. The obligatory bones mows about policy space and pro-growth reforms seemed to escape her lips with little conviction. An arpeggio of platitudes about greening investment and bolstering climate resiliency followed, but could such boilerplate pieties redound to more than gussied-up corporate PR? There was a deafening silence, one that has reverberated through the Glen protracted secular's staggering world economies. For a discipline that announced its conception as the dismal science, economics has evinced a surprising buoyancy over its 2.5-century lifespan. From the dizzying industrial revolutions to the profusion of innovative technologies, the material progress inaugurated and facilitated by the field's practitioners has continually outpaced even its most fecund projections. What enabled these recurrent upside surprises? A bottomless well of human ingenuity, forever renewing and transcending itself, coupled with mankind's boundless capacity for productive endeavor, or so the rosy Panglossian creed professed. Yet with each passing decade, that phenomenal innovative spring has seemed to grow incrementally shallower, less capable of replenishing the deep aquifers of growth. The Internet's frictionless exchange of information and ideas, extrapolated at the turn of the millennium to usher flowing waters of prosperity, have instead reverted to their more customary, gentle meander. The technological torrent powering the industrial age, from the cotton mills to the Model T assembly line, has steadily decelerated into a trickling labor-substituting rivulet. Automation and artificial intelligence, far from catalyzing a tidal wave of creative workforce displacement into dynamic new sectors, have witnessed the swelling of a veritable employment lacuna. And that process of creative destruction, so facilely evangelized by market acolytes, has tragically devolved into something more akin to rudderless, deconstructive erosion amid the upheavals of deglobalization. With its intellectual headwaters desiccating, economics finds itself paddling through increasingly arid intellectual terrain. The tracks of wilder-benighted peasantry, so buoyantly dismissed as the growing pains of swift modernization, have steadily metastasized into sprawling urban favelas and exurban deserts of dynastic resentment. The enlightened promissory notes issued to the so-called losers from liberalization have serially bounced, compounding the insolvencies of credibility for the reigning order. Small wonder, then, that the grandees of global economic governance, though self-appointed cartographers of progress, found themselves casting about for new lodestars on the horizon. Their dogmas of perpetual growth so internalized as to fossilize into self-evident catechism, they could muster only the palest auguries of dynamism persevering. Like battle-hazed veterans spooking at every respiring brook and fluttering pinion, any murmur of statistical encouragement was instantly metamorphed into the harbinger of renewed vigor. A stabilization of German factory orders became a growth rebound. Another month of American job creation, taking the unprecedented length of the expansion well past its projected expiration date, reinvigorated predictions of a self-sustaining recovery. With each ephemeral rally swiftly receding back into the prevailing eddies of inertia, however, the strained exertions grew more transparently tinged with desperation. Grand extrications from the slough were posited, always reliant upon some deus ex machina that perpetually demurred its entrance. Perhaps the latest innovations in artificial intelligence algorithms would unleash exponential productivity enhancements? A mere software update away from Promethean plenty, the new evangels of technological transcendence beckon productivity's redemption.